As you guys could tell, I've been having a conversation here, but it's noon and it is Tuesday, the 17th, September. We're almost 3/4 of the way through here. Today we're back at a hot topic. I hope that we're back to normal time frame where we should be looking at about 30 minutes or so. I put a few things together, but here's really what we want to focus with for this week, and that is help. So I want to kind of focus today around those things. And I've got a few pieces that people have talked to me about already that is areas where they need help. And yet what I want you to do is just make that note, maybe jot a little note down on a piece of paper that here's something that I've run into in the last 2 weeks that you need an assist with. What are those things? And we'll see the time that we've got. And we'll address any of the things that are come up. So help is the big one today. But let me go through these things that I already have set. And the first one is, I'm going to say, a reminder and also further clarification. So still dealing with what we've got, we know that in the past, we have always been able to deal with the buyer for compensation, the seller for compensation, the listing broker for compensation. We know that in the past, the way that we've always been compensated is because of our agreement with the listing and broker participating through the multiple listing service. So all of these things are still in place. And of course, the other is we know that we've always been able to also finance a buyer's broker commission. Now, rarely, I can't even tell you that I know of anybody that had to do it or did do it, but it was always a possibility to finance the buyer broker compensation. But here's what we know today and what we've done in the past. It was always signed, a buyer agency agreement was always signed. Problem was, admittedly, everybody in the industry, for the most part, when I say that, there was a small percentage that would always get it signed. They wouldn't work with somebody until they signed it. And they did the best job because of that in regards to getting their compensation. But here's what we know. Now, prior to touring homes, the buyer must sign an agreement before we can show them homes. And it's the buyer then that has really always been responsible for paying us. But see, again, it was always guaranteed through the offer of compensation through the MLS from the listing broker. But here's what we know. We've got to have that buyer representation contract, which is what these arrows are showing. So I always have this. And here's what that says. That buyer representation contract says any monies that I receive from the seller or the listing broker is credited toward that. So if a seller is paying it, we know that we need to have that on the purchase agreement. And if it's not a purchase agreement, it's an addendum to the purchase agreement saying that the seller will pay this. Now I'll show you something toward this, but here's what I know from talking with our managers, talking with many of you, and talking with agents from outside of our company. Almost everyone is putting it on the purchase agreement. And most of them are a really simple statement that just says seller to pay buyer broker fee. Okay. Now, if it is the listing broker, then we've got to have an agreement with the listing broker. Either side of the transaction that we're on, we've got to have a compensation agreement with that broker. Now, ours, I've abbreviated cooperating broker compensation agreement. So when we're going to ask the listing broker to pay, we need that signed. And we would sign that prior to the submission of the offer to the listing agent, listing broker. Okay. Now, in simplifying all of that, then, the only way that the buyer really is going to pay that, our 3%, we'll say, is if they want to pay it out of pocket. When would be the most common time that a buyer would pull it out of pocket? If they're making a cash offer. You see, the buyer's paying the same amount of money out of pocket, regardless of whether or not they ask the seller to pay it or if they're going to pay it themselves. So if a buyer's paying cash from a strategic mode of making that offer, it might actually be better for the buyer to pay our compensation directly. But it's really going to be up to them. Okay, so let me pause here for a second. If anybody's got anything that you have a question toward this, let's go ahead and address that real quick, because this has been one of the major areas for clarification that we're running into. I'm not seeing anything coming up in chat. So everybody's good?
Hey, Darwin?
Yes,
Good
Miss
morning
Brenda.
or good afternoon. On our PA, would you clarify, because I've gotten a couple of questions about whether or not they should be checking the seller is going to pay or if the broker is going to pay?
I'll tell you what, if I can hold on it, Brenda, I've got the PA coming up on another slide. And if you'll remind me at that point, if I miss it, let's do that there. Would that work? Perfect. Okay. So let me continue on, and I will definitely address that one because you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, it should come up with this one if I remember what I did. I want you to know compensation. This is another clarification. Compensation does not equal concession. These are two different terms handling two different items. So with one, what we're talking about is what I've highlighted here, the buyer broker compensation. So when we address compensation, it's the compensation. When we address the seller concessions, you'll see what I have underlined. So concessions are prepaids, tax prorations, closing costs, and any other allowable expense, meaning what will the lender allow, those would be concessions. So it is key to remember, those two must be separated. Our purchase agreement automatically does it, so it's just us as agents that we have to remember that. Okay, so that's again another point of clarification that I've been running into. And as long as we're on it, this is the great place to handle, Brenda, your question. So with paragraph 5, you guys have been hearing me use it. Keep it simple, salesperson. This is simplicity. And this is where I'm running into and finding that other brokers don't understand how simple this can be. Now, we may discover as we keep getting into this, that maybe it's got to be a little bit more detailed, but at this point, it shouldn't have to. So let's keep this simple. I'm going to go back to this slide first. So nothing has changed. We've always been able to get our compensation from these three, we'll call it 4 sources. Let's deal with the primary 3. This is where we've always gotten it from. This is looking directly at the purchase agreement. If these are the 3 sources, now refer to the purchase agreement. Because even if we finance it, that's the buyer paying the compensation. So let's go back. On the purchase agreement, we have 3 options. And what we were saying would likely happen is really happening. And that is that agents and brokers, realizing what we're dealing with, have consulted with the buyer, and the buyer is electing to have the seller pay it. They're building it into the transaction. So keep it simple. And if I asked you who's paying the compensation and how much, check the appropriate box. What we're going to say is most of the time, the seller is going to pay compensation, and we're going to ask them to pay the full compensation. We're signing them up for 3%. It doesn't matter what the seller was offering compensation. The buyer in their offer, and this is the way that we've got to look at the mindset. The buyer in their offer is saying, I don't care what the seller was offering. I want the seller to pay the 3%. So you're going to check off, because it's the seller is going to pay it. I'm going to check that off. I'm going to put 3%. Now, I just recently put together a deal with a vacant land. I did a flat fee because I knew that we were going to deal with less than $60,000 as a purchase price. My time is precious. I did a $1,500 minimum. Good thing I did, because they only wanted to do 3%. What's 3% of 40,000? $1,200. So I'm getting my minimum out of this. So in my case, we wrote the offer with it being the seller paying the compensation of $1,500. After some negotiation and playing hardball, and it's cash, I said, hey, buyer, let's just do the 40. You pay me the 1,500. I had to revise the purchase agreement, because now the buyer is paying me out of pocket the $1,500 that they signed an agreement for. Therefore, I'm checking the third box, and not a percentage, but the $1,500. Now, the middle option says the listing broker is paying a compensation. Yeah. Guys, that simply means this, that we're literally getting, we should be getting it from the listing broker. It shouldn't come from the seller. I'm not going to tell you that that's going to happen. I'm not going to tell you that's not going to happen. But based upon this, and then we have a compensation agreement, the listing broker should pay it. And it probably, if it's done that way, would have to be a check. If we're following the paperwork, that's the way it would happen if the listing broker is paying compensation. Again, I'm not going to guarantee when you work with somebody else that's the way it would happen. But you can get an idea why everyone is keeping it simple, and a buyer is asking a seller to pay the compensation. Now, the other thing I'll bring up, and then we'll open the floor up for questions on this one. The purchase agreement is between who? The buyer and the seller. Are we as brokers, listing broker, seller broker, are we a part of that agreement? Say no, because we're not. So it's only the buyer and the seller. So if the buyer and the seller agree, and we've checked off that the seller will contribute, everything's good. If it's the listing broker, we need that agreement that would be between listing broker and buyer's broker that says listing broker will compensate buyer broker. If it's from the buyer, then we're merely disclosing that the buyer is paying compensation. The reality is, if you look at listing broker being on the purchase agreement, that's not an agreement that the buyer, that the listing broker will pay it. Matter of fact, if we check buyer, that's not an agreement that the buyer will pay it. Rather, what we have here is we're telling everybody, hey, listing broker is going to pay it. We've got this compensation agreement if anybody needs it. And by the way, if there's a mortgage involved, mortgage company needs to know this information. And obviously the title company needs to know, because they need to know how to prepare the closing statements. And of course, what covers this with the buyer paying it? Buyer representation contract. So just go back to that previous slide, and that's what we would need to have. Obviously, as you keep going and you really look at this, the simplest thing is for the buyer to ask the seller to pay compensation. Okay? I
have a
got a question in my group here.
Okay. The second one is listing broker.
Okay?
If the purchase agreement between buyer and seller, why we put that one there?
Great
Because
question.
the seller is going and buyer is going to sign the purchase.
Yeah.
agreement.
So, what we
should
just
have-
had here in the office is looking at the listing broker. And with the understanding that the purchase agreement is between the buyer and the seller, why is it on here? Well, again, let me go back. It's not much more than a disclosure to all parties that the compensation for the buyer's broker is being paid through the listing broker and there is another agreement that that's happened. So when we check off, and actually either one of these two, listing or buyer, listing broker or buyer, those two boxes are just merely a disclosure telling mortgage company, title company, the listing broker, because this is our purchase agreement, the listing side title company, it's telling everybody, here's how the compensation's being handled. The only one that really binds any parties is the first one, and that's the seller to the buyer. So absolutely correct. These two are not creating an agreement. These two are really just disclosure, but it's addressing how it gets handled. Because take this scenario, because this has actually happened. An agent calls a listing broker, says, hey, are you offering compensation? Yep, we'd be offering X%. They don't address it on the purchase agreement, and there's no compensation agreement. How does that agent get compensated? Simple answer, by the way, would be out of the goodness of the listing broker's heart. Because I would assume that the buyer didn't have the money. In most cases, the buyers are going to have the money to pull it out of their pocket. So even if they had the buyer agency contract, which they should have signed, the buyer is responsible to pay that. But if it took all of their money to buy the house and they haven't got that money left over, how are you going to get compensated? Now, the answer would be is you're going to have to pursue it in court, because it would have to come from the buyer, because there was no other agreement out there. So keep that in mind. If it's not addressed on a purchase agreement, we should be getting clarification to make sure that we're not going to run into problems come closing time. Okay, I got a question here again.
Okay, for the same scenario.
Same scenario.
Can the compensation be split between buyer and seller?
Can the compensation be
To put one
split?
number
Ah.
on number 3?
I think what you're saying is could I, in this case, check off the seller?
Have agreement, like.
Yeah. Could we have it between the seller and the buyer paying the buyer broker compensation?
Okay.
Answer is yes. I would work it out so that I'm getting it from one party, but the answer is yes. I could get, say, 2% from the seller and 1% directly from the buyer. But if the buyer is going to pull that out of their pocket, okay, I could see it happening, but why not get it all from that one source? So you would do that, and you would check both boxes, because appropriately, it would be the seller who will contribute 2% in this scenario, and I would check buyer who will pay 1%. And now it's covered.
Especially during the negotiation of the commission.
Yes,
3%. They said the seller, I would pay only 2%. I will not pay you 3%.
Ah,
Yeah.
so here's another question then. Another easy one. What happens when I call the seller's agent and the seller's agent says, yes, we're offering 2%. But I've got a buyer representation agreement that says I get 3%. Well, I'd ignore it and I'm just going to build the 3% into the purchase agreement. Because it doesn't matter. It's what the buyer's offer is. So what I would tell you, don't be concerned with what the listing broker or the seller is offering. Because again, mindset, it's one and the same. It's that money that they've already negotiated, and the seller, just like us, has given us approval to market. If it's 3%, we got the approval to go out and offer 3%. Okay. But it doesn't matter when it comes to the negotiation. The buyer owes you 3%. Buyer, how do you want to get that to me? Well, let's put it in the offer. Don't let your commission, and I can say this to you guys in our group, don't allow your commission to be negotiated as part of the contract. And when I say the contract, don't allow it to be negotiated as part of the purchase agreement. You negotiated that with the buyer when you signed the buyer representation contract. There is no need for you to negotiate that when it comes to your purchase agreement. The buyer owes you that money. That's how they've elected to get you compensated. Now, if they choose to do well, if they're offering 2, I'll pay the 1 out of my pocket. Okay, you still got your 3, and now we've talked about how to complete that. So that was a great question. There's no questions, nothing in the chat. Everybody is good with that then? Are there any questions toward this now?
Hello.
You got it.
Hi, this is Lisa. I don't have my picture up there, but so what you're saying in that situation that you just said, where if the seller were paying 2% and the buyer paying 1%,
Yes,
in that case, would both the seller box and the buyer box be checked, noting the 2% and the 1% in the purchase agreement?
correct. You
Okay,
would check
thank you.
both, because that's where I say when we stay to the simplicity and we don't try to muddy this or overthink it, the seller's paying 2%, the buyer's paying 1%.
Right.
So you would check it off exactly that way.
And the only reason the listing broker box doesn't show compensation is because it's not allowed to be a part of the purchase contract.
No,
Oh,
it's because the listing
it's
broker is
disclosure.
not paying it.
It's just disclosing
It would be a disclosure
to look for the addendum.
if it existed. Okay, so Lisa, I kind of think I know where you're at, because I've had a lot of folks with this confusion. Let's simplify it. There are 3 places we can get compensated from, right?
Correct.
And those 3 places are from the buyer, from the seller, or the listing broker. We don't want to confuse seller and listing broker. There are 2 separate entities. Okay. What I find us doing is we're putting those 2 together and counting them as the same entity. Nope. They're 2 separate entities. So if we separate them and we go back to the aspect of the purchase agreement is saying, here's who is paying the buyer broker compensation. So I called the listing broker, and the listing broker said, yep, I have got 2% with my seller. Now, if we go by the terms of the listing contract exactly, then the money would flow this way if we're going to get it from the listing broker. Because the listing broker, we'll take it so that we don't get in trouble. We take a listing and it's 6%. Next paragraph, the seller authorizes us to offer 3% to a buyer's broker.
Right.
Okay? Now, does it matter whether or not we pay that 3% or if the seller pays that 3%? Doesn't matter, okay? What's going to dictate how that gets handled is the purchase agreement. So if I get a purchase agreement that says seller to pay 3% of the purchase price, because that's how simple most of them are being written in additional conditions, then we are not paying 3% compensation as a listing broker, the seller is. However, if a buyer agent was to send us and we sign a broker compensation agreement, then they're asking us to pay that. Therefore, we, the listing broker, would be paying. Okay? So those need to be separated. And by the way, we're just talking paperwork. Okay? That would be the paperwork. So the listing contract says, I, the listing broker, will pay you, or excuse me, seller signs the listing contract with the listing broker, you, saying that they will pay you 6%. And you're authorized to pay 3% to a buyer's broker. Therefore, if they say, you, Lisa, have to do this, you're the listing broker, listing agent, then on a closing statement, here's what it should say. That the seller paid the listing broker 6%.
Right, okay.
And at the closing, I, the listing broker, hand you, the buyer broker, a check for 3%.
Like always.
You
Darwin,
got it.
So-
It's the way it's the way it should have always actually been done.
Yeah.
But we always just did it for the convenience of the seller. Well, now they're really trying to detail everything. Well, if it says the listing broker pays it, then the listing broker should pay it. If it is the seller who's paying it, seller should pay it. If it's the buyer should pay it. In the paperwork, closing statement should show that. Okay.
So the
I
phone
heard,
call before showing the property that you make to the listing broker, or the listing agent, you just ask them if there's a broker compensation agreement, they say yes.
well, I would ask, are you offering compensation?
Right,
They
But
say,
to the buyer.
Yep.
Us.
Yep.
Yes. But don't we need to ask them how much?
you should and could.
Right.
Yep, I
And
think
that goes
that's our
under the
fiduciary
addendum?
duty.
Darwin, when you're doing that, we send a letter to them saying that they are, and they sign it. The listing broker will sign it saying, yes, we're giving 3% to the buying broker. So in that case, shouldn't you check both boxes, the seller and the listing broker? You've just
Well,
made that.
No, because you just signed that the listing broker is going to
Because
pay
the
it.
seller's already paying the listing.
Well, then that is why all these listing brokers are saying they're not going to sign that contract, because then they would be held liable for that 3%. So so technically us sending that to them, that is why we're getting the pushback that they don't want to sign it.
Correct.
So technically, the listing broker is never going to be in the compensation.
Well,
When-
you use the
Or
word technically,
when
but
does the listing broker pay the compensation?
whenever they sign that agreement to say that they will.
And the 3% would be listed in an addendum, correct?
Nope.
I
Because
thought you said-
remember, addendum, what are the first three letters to addendum? Add. You're adding to the purchase agreement.
Oh,
So
okay.
we're not going to ask or sign a listing broker up as part of the purchase agreement. That's what the broker compensation agreement is for.
Oh, okay, so it's a separate agreement totally from the purchase contract.
You got it.
But that
Totally
will
separate.
state how much they are compensating the buying broker.
Yeah, the key is on the purchase agreement. The clarity is in the simplicity. Who's paying you and how much? Check that off with those 3 boxes. The clarity is in the simplicity. Who's paying you and how much?
Right, but checking the second box does not tell you how much.
Does not. Because what do you have to see?
A compensation agreement. And that will list in saying that, you're right, maybe I said that wrong, okay.
Yep, no, you got it. You got it, Lisa. You got that right now.
No, that's
And
really
for-
good, because you
Mhm.
really made that clear. But I just wrote an offer, and in the purchase agreement, I wrote seller shall pay Century 21 Town and Country 3% to the buyer broker. But because when I called, they said that they were paying 3%, but they didn't ask them who. So should I be asking who's paying, if the listing agent is paying, or if the seller is paying?
No. Great question, Lydia, but the answer is no, you don't need to know, because here's what it is.
It's confidential.
This is the most difficult part, because we're building it into the transaction. And there's an agreement between the seller and the listing broker that says, if you will, I'm gonna use interpretive language, is what most contracts, including ours, is really saying. The seller is saying, look, I'm going to give you all that money, and you have my approval to tell everybody that we'll pay 3%. Now that we,
In writing,
and it's in writing, right?
Yeah.
It's because it's paragraph, you're going to pay me 6, you're authorizing me as to who I can pay and as to how much. So if you will, they're authorizing us, and when I say us, the seller, us, the listing brokers. They're saying that one of us can go ahead and pay that 3%. Go ahead and tell the world that we will pay that 3%. Okay? That's what they're telling us. Now, the buyer makes an offer. Does the buyer care whether or not it comes from the listing broker or the seller? They don't care. So just get it from the seller. We're going to keep it the simplest way possible. Now, that being the case, then it really doesn't matter. Now, and you got to stick with me here, because we have a tendency to hear what we want to hear. But I'm going to tell you, it doesn't matter what the seller is offering / listing broker is offering. It doesn't matter. The buyer owes you your compensation you've agreed to. How do they want to get you paid? Because they could, looking at the agreement, we already have one signed, it's a buyer representation contract. They'll say, yep, no problem, we'll pull it out of pocket, we'll pay you. They can do that. They could say that, well, the listing broker, but they're not going to do that. I say, because of your guidance, the easiest thing that we've found is to ask the seller to pay it. Now, if they offer 2 and you have 3, what is the buyer going to ask? Pay for the 3.
So
Part of the
then I just,
negotiation.
okay, so I think I'm clear, because if you check the box that says listing broker, see compensation, you're assuming that the listing broker is going to take care of the compensation. So
Not
if I put in
assuming,
the,
not assuming, Lydia, they've signed a contract.
right, if
Should
they
that
sign
come
it.
together, here's
So
what
what
they
I
say.
did, so what I didn't disclose is that when I wrote the offer, I wrote in the purchase agreement that the seller would pay the 3%, but I also sent agency, the buyer of agency disclosure and the compensation. And the agent said that she didn't need to sign the compensation because she had already signed the buyer agency agreement, the what do you call it? The thing that says all of a
It
sudden I
would be
have
our
no.
compensation agreement.
No, I signed the one that says that I'm representing the buyer.
Agency relationship.
agency.
Thank you. No, not
disclosure,
that
buyer
one. The
representation
one
agreement?
page that says you're paying me 3%. The seller signed that one, the agent signed that one, but she didn't want to sign the compensation, corporate and broker compensation agreement. But I had her sign it anyhow. So is
Good.
that all screwed up?
I would, and if you want to do this, Lydia, you can go ahead and scan and email that to me, and I'll take a look at the specific paperwork you used.
Okay.
Because I'm not certain all of what you would be addressing.
And
But-
also what I'm not saying is that I used the form before this one, because we,
okay. So
yeah, because
the
they did not,
notice
it
of
didn't have
buyer
the one.
agency.
No, the buyer compensation agreement, I used the one before this one because it was around the 17th of
Okay.
August.
So, but remember this one, that's between you and the buyer.
If the buyer.
No, no,
That-
the seller is paying the 3%. That's not a
I
problem.
understand,
They
but
didn't pay
But
3%.
that one has only the agreement, when you say buyer representation agreement, that is between us as the broker and them as a buyer. That's guaranteeing that they will see that you get paid.
Now I'm
Okay.
confused.
Well, it's a buyer representation.
Maybe I
agreement.
confuse you.
Well, let me stay with the three.
Okay,
And we'll go through quickly, just in case everybody is, you sign a buyer representation agreement.
right,
That makes the buyer responsible to pay you 3%.
right,
And then it says, anything that I get from the listing broker or the seller is credited toward that amount.
right.
Now that's that agreement.
Mm-hmm.
The other agreement that we're looking at is, how do I get paid now that we have a transaction? So the buyer is going to direct you to either go ahead and negotiate your compensation directly with the listing broker. If so, that's the compensation agreement.
Right,
And that's between us and a listing broker.
okay,
If the buyer says, hey, let's just have the seller pay it, that's the purchase agreement. Okay? And where that happens is by checking that box right there. Whoops, I shouldn't have touched it. But checking right there. And that's the agreement between the buyer and the seller. Again, these other two, just disclosing to everyone else that the buyer broker compensation is going to be paid by a listing broker, and there should be a compensation agreement signed between the two of them. This one says the buyer's paying the buyer's broker directly. Okay?
I have a question, maybe
And-
not a
and so
question.
again,
I think,
Don't,
So
what
you
I
know
want
what?
to say is don't overcomplicate the simplicity of this agreement, okay? Go ahead.
Hey,
so,
Darwin. Go ahead,
so
Lydia.
my
let me get
buyer
Brenda,
broker
'cause I-
compensation did not have number 5 where I had the choices of boxes to check.
Ah, I got you, Lydia. So,
Because this is the one before the one we're using
Okay.
right now,
so
because
let's
this was
do
done.
this for being able to move on and not.
So you
hold
know, that's
everybody.
okay. I'll just send you the stuff and you can
That's
look
what I
at
was
it.
just gonna say.
That's
Let's do
fine.
that,
Okay.
okay? All
Okay.
right.
Hey,
The
Darwin?
Rochester group, I think somebody had something there.
I
Um,
did, Darwin, I had a quick
Jim, I'll come to
question.
you next.
Okay.
Go ahead, Brenda.
Okay, so, I think I heard Lydia say that she shared the exclusive buyer's contract agreement with.
No, I
the-
did not. No,
Oh,
I
you
did not.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, because I was gonna say, if I'm submitting an offer, I'm submitting the, agency disclosure document, but I never share the exclusive buyer's agreement with
Right.
the other party. I mean, to
Yep.
me, that would be the same thing as, if I asked to see their listing agreement.
Correct.
Right. What I
has
sent,
nothing
what
to-
I sent was the notice of buyer agency. That's what I sent.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's what
I
I
said
thought.
that they would pay me 3%.
Right.
All right.
Okay, but again, just for clarification for the folks on this end, we would only check that our compensation is coming from the listing broker if, at the time of writing the offer, we have a signed co-op broker agreement. If we
Correct.
do not have that document, then we go to the seller on behalf of our buyer to ask
Yes.
for whatever, 3%, 2%, whatever it is that they want.
Yes.
Got
Yep.
it? Okay, clear?
But now let me, not to throw anything into it, but what's easier? To call the listing broker and find out how much they're offering compensation, then get this document signed prior to submission of the offer?
That's the
Or
number
calling
one
the listing
choice.
broker saying, how much are you guys offering, going, thank you, and having the buyer put it on their purchase agreement, asking the seller to pay it?
I think the first option is the best,
Well, it could be, but the
if it
simplest,
works.
just have the seller pay it. Just have the seller pay it. It's the same money. And that's what I want everybody to see. It's the same money. That 3% is coming from the same source. It's just, what is the paper trail that we'd have to follow? Okay?
How it's being dispersed.
Yeah, how it's being dispersed. So either way works as long as you understand you're checking off who's paying you. Okay? Jim Lorch, let me get Jim here. He's been. Go ahead,
Yes,
Jim.
sir. Yes, sir. Two things just for clarification here on asking the seller to pay for it and finding out if there's anything being offered out. There's not really a need to find out how much is being offered out if you're going to ask the seller to pay for it. Is there any responsibility that we have to find out
Same thing.
what was
Yeah.
being offered out? That's my
So,
first
Jim,
question.
Great question. So let me hit that, and if you got a follow-up, we'll hit that. But you
Yeah,
just really introduced it quite well. And the answer is no. There is no real need for us to do it outside of fiduciary duties. So knowing our fiduciary duties, and I made a round to everybody, and if I said, okay, tell me your 6 fiduciary duties, everybody could write them out just boom, that quick, right? And I know better than that. But one of them is reasonable care. And I always do / due diligence. So in doing your due diligence, is that information that the buyer may find helpful in putting together a strategy on how to build their offer.
and the answer is yes.
So as much as when do I even need to know that? Before I write the offer. But if the buyer's going to have the seller pay it, the only reason it matters is because it's due diligence and it might change how they negotiate their offer.
Sure. Yep.
Okay. So I'll clarify. We don't really need to know, but the buyer may want to know that.
Got you.
Okay.
Yep. Yep. So my other question has to do with, so I have a listing out there, took it for 6%, offered out 3% to the buyer's agents. And then I have somebody that reaches out to me, sees my listing, and I asked, are you working with an agent? No, I'm just reaching out to you as the listing agent. I'd like to see it. Great, you show it to them, and then they want to write up an offer through you as a customer, not as a client. And which happened to me this summer with one of my properties. So I had both sides. So how does it work out in terms of because NAR is requiring that we have, in order to get paid from the buyer side, obviously we don't have a contract with that buyer.
Okay.
So just
Jim,
flesh that out. You know what I'm
so
saying? How do you end up getting both sides without a buyer, exclusive buyer contract?
Sides and compensated for both sides. Okay. So the answer is in the listing contract. So when you signed a listing contract, how much did you sign it for?
6%.
There you go. I'm waiting to see if I could get your response, but
Right.
that is how you get it, because what you have, Jim, is it doesn't say that specifically to a buyer's broker. Although it says you can promote and offer it to a buyer's broker, you can promote it and offer it to a transaction coordinator, you could promote it and offer it to a sub-agent. But how much did it say that they would pay you? 6%. So I don't need a contract with the buyer to get all 6% because I've already got the contract signed with the listing broker.
Yep. All right. Now that makes sense. I just wondered if the August 17th date changed anything up that way.
It did not. It did not. You know, a great question. You just clarified something for a whole lot of people. And I
Now,
won't
if you-
complicate it any further because there is a situation where it could get nasty.
What's that?
We're not gonna hit that one today.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Darwin.
Just, yeah, get your full compensation. It's one of the reasons why it's best to not just get a 3 and offer 0, but to get the full 6%. I'll keep it simple on that one for that today. Okay,
Yep. And I did. So.
all right. Good job. Good
Yep.
job. I got one here. If the listing agent has an agreement for 6 and we're offering 3, then we put the 3% from the seller in the PA. Doesn't that allow the listing agent to double dip and keep the 6? Actually, Kevin, it's funny, you had that written in there before James just asked his question, but that is the same exact scenario.
Okay.
So yes, that's going to get you the full 6% when you have both sides representing only the seller. Okay, so great,
Okay.
great one. Great question there. How are we doing? Anybody else got anything there? Otherwise, I think, let's see if I can keep this simple with, I was hoping we wouldn't hit too much, but guys, if this is still driving
Darwin,
us nuts, we gotta hit it. Go ahead.
Darwin, can I ask another follow-up question on that?
Yeah,
So with our purchase agreement there, we have the 3 boxes and you're writing up for a buyer as a customer because they came to you directly as the listing agent. What would you check in there? Listing broker, right? I mean, you got to check one of those.
yeah, I would do the listing broker because it's in-house, we're handling it, it's all set.
Right.
Okay, I thought you
Yep.
said that other situation was the seller box was checked.
Well, in this case though, Lisa, we've got Jim who has both sides of the transaction.
Right.
So he's double dipping. So we're collecting it from ourselves.
Right, but didn't you just say the person before Jim, I missed their name, who had it in a question that you read? Wasn't it the same situation? I thought you had said that they checked the seller contributes. Maybe I misheard you.
Well, his chat, let me see.
Yeah, so Darwin, to clarify, what I was asking there is not necessarily an in-house move. If I'm dealing with an agent, can the other agent keep the 6% and then, because the sellers agreed to pay us the 3? That's all I'm trying to figure out is
Okay.
is
Let me
that
see if
screwing up
I
the
get this
paperwork?
right. Let me create a scenario and see if it's what you're hitting here. So Lisa, then we don't want to hit Kevin's directly with Jim's. So Jim's is or
Right.
Kevin's is a little bit different here. So if I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this one needs to be hit anyway. And I think I know what you're talking with the double dip. We don't want to sign, and this is part of the risk of the compensation agreement. We don't want to sign that we're going to pay 3%. And then they come around with a purchase agreement that says the seller's going to pay 3% because the net buyer's broker is getting 6%. And I will tell you, I've seen that. I've seen the compensation agreement signed that the listing broker would pay 3%. And the purchase agreement that accompanies it saying the seller will pay 3%.
Yeah,
That would have to be clarified.
So we don't want the compensation agreement if we're checking seller. We just want it totally to ride in there, and that'll
One
sort
or
that.
the other.
Okay.
One or the other. So yeah, that was a great question, and that is happening. And by the way, sometimes we're getting that, meaning we've received that, and we have to be careful that we haven't committed to 2 3%ers. We only need 1. So, and I believe this will happen, but when you have both, get clarification as to which way that is supposed to happen. Okay? And again, it's the reason I'm just going, I think we're all gonna figure it out. Just ask the seller to pay it.
I
Okay,
have a question, Darwin.
all right, let's hear.
You're representing the seller and the seller's not willing to pay the buyer broker compensation, okay? A buyer comes to you and wants to purchase the property. How do you get the 3% from the buyer then? Because you can't have a
You
contract
had
with
to
the
do
buyer.
it, didn't you, Holly?
I'm sorry.
Good question.
Okay, so Jim Holly brought it up anyway. Guys, this is the difficult one. And at this point, I'm gonna tell you, I don't know that there's a real clear answer. I can tell you all the things that we're gonna have to battle with. So let's clarify to make sure that we're all understanding what Holly just asked. So as individuals, we went out, we took a listing. We did everything that we could to get that seller to understand the importance of being able to offer that 3% as compensation to a buyer's broker. We told them about the marketability. You're going to get more money if you do, the saleability, all the things that go along with that, right? And the seller says, really nice, but Ronnie, I don't care. I'll pay you 3%, but no, I am not paying a buyer broker fee. We all know we're taking that listing as long as it's a saleable listing with all the other terms being offered, okay? We're going to take that listing. Now, with Holly's scenario on that listing, we hold it open. And lo and behold, walking in the door is Tommy and Jeannie from Timbuktu, right? And they go, oh, we love it, Ronnie. We want to buy it. Can you take care of it? Okay. There's Holly's question. How do you get paid? Because you got a listing agreement, it's only 3%. See, when we're talking Jim's scenario, we had 6 total. Now we've only got 3. How do you get paid for taking care of both sides? Ruh-roh. Well, I could sign the buyer up and represent them and have a contract where they got to pay me 3%. Okay, well, let's take a look at that scenario first. You just diminished your responsibilities to the seller whom you represented and owed all of your fiduciary duties to, 1. And you knowing that they didn't want to pay the buyer broker fee, there's now in this transaction going to be a buyer broker fee. There's a dilemma here. This is ethics. This is, and by the way, I don't have an answer for us, because signing that buyer up so that you can get paid for that sign, is that acting in the best interest of your seller? Okay. Well, somebody said, well, we don't need to represent them to get paid. Great point. So I could simply have an agreement for compensation. Now I still owe all of my fiduciary responsibilities to my seller. Thumbs up, right? Except for you still got 3% that needs to come in from somewhere, because you just signed the buyer up not to be represented, but to pay you. So my point is, yep, you could do either one of those two. What I can say from a point of ethics, from a point of agency law, there's not a good answer for that right now. And then
What if you were acting on behalf of the listing agent? You told the buyer that you are
the listing agent, Lisa.
Yes, you are the listing agent. You have an open house, someone comes to you, and you present an offer to the seller without representing the buyer, and they accept the offer as written, but they counter 3% above that purchase price to take care of the buyer's agent.
It's the only way that it would really work. But I'd ask you, did the seller still net all the money they were supposed to when you, because you had to have a contract with the buyer that says they'd pay you. And the buyer would have to put it in there. It just what I want you to do is to know that
It'd be an
we can
addendum.
do all the things that we've just discussed.
Yeah.
The question is how does that impact our ethics and our fiduciary duties to that seller client? So in the end, here's the way I'm going to answer it. I'm going to say, you need to talk with your managing broker when you run into that scenario. Okay. Because I don't have a right answer to say, this is the way that as a company, we want you to follow this. But
Hey, Darwin.
hey, Jim, hold for a second, because I want to wrap it this way.
Sure.
In the past, you've had this scenario. I have a buyer, and I show this buyer a for sale by owner. What did you do? Don't answer that, because I already know the answers, but I know how much you charged. So it's the same thing. Bottom line, you may not get paid for that side because the buyer is acting on their own behalf. Just saying, it's the same thing. I'll leave you with that thought on that one. And Jim, how did you want to handle that or follow up there?
Well, just honoring fiduciary responsibilities and ethics. If your seller wasn't willing to do 6% and just wanted to do 3% to pay you, and you had that open house scenario, and somebody said, hey, you could just tell them, hey, I would love to be able to help you, but my seller is not offering out a buyer compensation here. If you'd like to write up an offer, I don't know, send them to somebody else and call a banker who's
3% building in. By the way,
yeah.
Listen, I've thought of that one too, but you're giving money away, and if it went to somebody else in the office, which would be the logical thing to do, there's still now 3%. Did you act in the best interest of your seller?
Well,
and again,
but you're not saying how much it's going to be. Just saying
right
that my seller didn't agree to do enough that would cover me doing both sides. So basically, you're telling them find an agent.
Find an agent, let them handle it for you.
But
yeah,
but it's
Yeah,
really
I'm going
not-
to tell you, I've thought of that one too, and I can tell you, I just haven't heard of a scenario that is comfortable until I throw it out to you. And let me throw it again. In the past, you had a buyer whom you represented who signed on to pay you 3%, and you found them a for sale by owner. How much did you charge? Now, nobody needs to answer that again, because we all know what the answer to that is. This scenario is simply reversed. So my recommendation, make sure you get your full compensation.
you
Good stuff.
really is, I mean, how realistic is it really that another agent from another company is going to come in and do this without charging the seller the 3% that they're getting?
They're going to.
So, I mean, I think the last line with the seller needs to be, I'm going to take your listing, but you're going to end up paying this other 3%, whether you want to or not. It's going to be in there.
I think it's a wonderful way of seeing it. But in the event, Kevin, you just simply got a seller that won't see the light, and that will happen.
Understand, but and then the later conversation when it comes in and all of the offers have that compensation written in, this is where you very politely and nicely say, I told you so. You know.
I won't disagree. I'm going to move on from this one. Let's see what we can do to wrap up. I wanted to just kind of bring this out to you that on our listings, there are going to be those who are going to ask us to sign. As a company, we are still agreeing to sign these. Okay. But there's been very few that have come through with us being the one responsible to pay the buyer broker. But we do need to have a compensation agreement that comes in from them. And what I would suggest is that you have your manager review the form. So I scanned this one because I received it, and you're going to notice this is EXP. If I showed you all of it, you would see that this is from Colorado. Okay, and if you read the whole thing, it's still very, very simple. The only thing that I didn't like about it is it doesn't specify the buyer. So one of the things is we cannot sign a blanket agreement with with any other broker that says, sell this listing, we'll pay you 3%. To an extent, that's what I see with this one. So this particular agent, I said, you know what, probably best that we're okay with signing it, but I wanted to see the buyer's names on there. That way it's if this buyer were to come along. And even the aspect of acceptable terms is another word that I think is on there. And guys, I just want to cover real quick with EMDs. Here's state law, not just a company policy, but when we receive an earnest money deposit, we have to bring it to the company. We have to bring it to the office. Can't hold it. It's not you get to hold it for 48 hours, but the company has to deposit within 48 hours.
After hours, what do you do?
So if it's after hours, great question. So if it's after hours, as soon as you can, it would be the next day. So what if it was Friday night? None of our offices are open on Saturday, Sunday, Monday. But I get nervous. I don't want to hold somebody else's money. I want to get it in here. See, I get goosebumps just thinking about having somebody else's money, being responsible for it. I don't like that. Look, yeah. So if it's in the weekend, you got to hold it. But again, what it says is you're going to turn it to the office immediately. Well, immediately would be at the next day open office.
Buyers know that?
No, buyers won't. It's just really what we have to live up
Because he's
to.
gonna ask me the money if it's there or not. I'll ask him before you give me the check.
Yeah.
If it's the money there first.
Yes, yeah. Is this check good? Isn't it crazy? We got to ask that.
Sometimes you do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here's the other part. Then the company has to deposit it within 48 hours of receipt of acceptance. Now that's law. But here's what we know. As soon as we have it, as a company, we don't think any different than the way Darwin does it. I don't want to hang on to that. Get that into the non-interest bearing trust account so it can't get lost. Okay. And Miriam's over here, and Miriam doesn't want to hang on to somebody else's money or be responsible for that. So we're going to deposit it as soon as possible. So here's one of the most common ones. And it says, if it is to be held by someone outside of the company, it must be stated on the PA. Now, here's our purchase agreement. Buyer is depositing with a broker blank dollars. Okay. Now that says when I wrote this offer, the buyer gave me whatever the amount is that I put in that particular blank. In which case, I then sign that I have that. Okay. So the only time that I'm putting any amount in this first blank is when I got it.
The second one you don't.
Now, if I'm not getting that, I put 0. But I'm going to add 10,000 to the 0 within blank calendar days. 2, 3, could be 5. I wouldn't do any more than 5 because typically it's when we're getting it by mail. And of course, we now know that for a few dollars, somebody can actually wire it to us. Okay. So whatever that additional money is. Now, if I'm doing it this way, it would be 0. I'll use 10,000 for a total of 10,000. I could 1,000 now, 9,000 upon acceptance, or 5 and 5, total of 10, whatever, however that is. But that's the way that we need to see that. But what I want you to catch, buyer is depositing with broker. It's saying we got it. Almost all purchase agreements are written this way. There are some companies where it will say, buyer is depositing with blank title company. Fantastic. If you got a builder, it may say depositing is to deposit with builder blank dollars. Then it's all covered. But you need to take a look, and what I would tell you is if it's not with the broker. It needs to be specified on the purchase agreement who is actually holding it. So that's another common one that I've been working with and finding. The last thing that I had for you guys today, gosh, it's still, I really thought we'd be done in 30 minutes, but that's okay.
Darwin, I still
This,
had a
this buyer
question.
stuff is
in chat.
new. So go ahead, Valerie. What was that?
I still had a question in chat.
Oh, well, as long as you're there, hit me.
List agreement is 6%. Offer comes in below asking price. Can seller reduce compensation to buyer's agent as a counter? And the next part is, can we say seller is offering 3% for a full price offer?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, Valerie, this is a really good one. Glad you didn't let me silence it. Our response when somebody calls out and says, hey, Cliff, are you guys offering compensation? You would say the seller is offering 3% for a full price offer. That's really, so yeah, matter of fact, Valerie, I think everybody's going, oh, that's really good stuff, because that really is. See, when we signed the agreement, it said, you can list my home for 300,000 and offer 3% under these terms. So if it came in at $299,999.99, the 3% is off. And it's only a penny different. So yeah, it really is. So Valerie, great question. Yeah, your best response. The seller is offering this. Matter of fact, if I gave full, let's do this. The seller has authorized me to offer 3% for a full price offer. Or above. Or above. So yeah, that's a great question. Now, to the first part of it. Is it then open for negotiation? Clearly, the answer is yes. However, my book says this. I don't want to negotiate compensation. Let me negotiate the purchase price. Because the buyers probably signed up for that amount. So if you think about it, let's say they came in at 3 versus 2. And it's a $300,000 house. How much is 1%? $3,000. Now, first off, that's all we're talking about is $3,000 on this one, right? So if the seller was to say, listen, I'll pay your compensation. Well, and let's say it was $299 to stay with our scenario. Offer at $299, give me 3%. Seller says, nope. But I will pay it if you do 3.0, or it could be, well, $299, but what really do we have to negotiate? My point is this. Somebody's going to pay it. Who is it? The buyer. Because the seller has a bottom line. And so that would go to the same, by the way, did that answer that one for you, Valerie? Both sides of that one?
Yeah, thanks.
Awesome. Great question. Thank you for bringing that one up. And I just forgot where I was going to go with that.
Yeah, 299.
That didn't help, Ronnie. I know. I just can't remember what I was going to go in a totally different direction. It'll come back to me maybe before we wrap up here real quick.
Take a sip.
Take a hit of Coke. Open houses. Don't know if Sally or Steven are on, but Sally Hendricks and I were just talking about this and what's really working. Where are they getting sales? And I believe that she had mentioned, and Steven was on with us last week for the deep dive. And he said, look, open houses, guys, open houses are working. Sally, if I remember the number right, said that of their sales this year, they've got $5.8 million in sales that they can attribute to open houses. And the follow-up from those open houses, 5.8 million. She's got another agent that's just dropped in that she recruited from another company who's, I believe, closing 3 deals. So what I wanted to throw out, what am I hearing is really working? And it was kind of a projected thing. What's the easiest way for buyers to see homes without being committed? Without having to sign a contract? Go to open houses. So as the public gets educated on this, they're gonna go to open houses because they don't have to sign contracts.
Yeah, but they're gonna sign later.
Well, they would later, but at that point, you've already got a great rapport with them. They like you, they trust you, they respect you. They'll sign a contract at that point. So the key being, hold open houses. There's a lot of people that are gonna come to them.
Question is a question. When we go to listing agreement, why we have to go through 1, 2, 3? Buyer, seller, listing broker. So you are my seller, I am the broker.
Okay?
I sign your listing agreement.
Yep,
And I say I need a 6% commission,
yep,
okay? You're gonna sign to pay me 6% commission to Century 21, Triple I North.
Yes.
Down and country, okay, and finish. And then, when the buyer agent is coming, try to put an offer, purchase agreement,
yes,
all he need to see how much is Century 21 offering commission.
yes.
You're gonna tell them, we're gonna give you 3%. Okay, send me that addendum, listing company, you're gonna pay me 3% commission and finish. Even with the open house you have, that seller, he agreed to pay you 6%. That's
Correct.
6% paying to the listing company, not to the buyer agent.
Everything you said, absolutely right. My point in bringing this out, what's working? How are you finding business? How are you getting business? Open houses.
Yes, which is, I did have an open house a couple days ago. I may get probably an offer, which is couple
Well, you're
buyers.
not from a point of selling the house. How do I find business? And so guys, this is where I'm wanting to go.
From the open house, and also you may get an offer from that.
And see, that's right. Why do we do open houses? To get leads, that I hopefully can then end up closing, because how are we getting our leads? Are we doing all the basic things that we should be doing? But then once I go past that, what's working? Open houses. You will get leads if you're holding open houses. That's where that's the reason I wanted to bring this up.
Let me phrase another question. I think, I don't know if that meeting is over or not, that class. Let's say I have an open house.
Can
I'm
you
a
guys,
listing-
can you guys hear Andy in this one?
I'm a listing broker, okay? And I send Ronnie, not me, Ronnie, he's an agent here,
Okay,
do the open house for me.
yep,
When he is there, Ronnie, he's an agent, he may get a buyer.
yep.
Now Ronnie.
Might
is
get a
gonna-
seller, might
Yeah.
get both on it.
Yes. Ronnie, now he's gonna put an offer for me. I'm a listing broker because I send him to do open house. The buyer is.
Well,
coming
he's
to-
gonna do the business himself. It's not really for
Yeah, but
you.
he could also, that buyer walk into my open house and he's there. He
He's
could
there.
say, he could put an offer for me. Now, the seller is gonna be, this is another agent than me.
Mhm.
I'm a listing broker and he's a buyer agent. Because I did not wanna be.
Well,
that
he's
guy.
only gonna be the buyer's agent, and this is a matter of terms. If the seller says yes, or the buyer says, yes, represent me. Because remember, we can't force a buyer to be represented,
Well,
but he would be working with the buyer.
But you're supposed to have to tell him that he could write the offer instead of me, but I just.
Oh, you're there, why are you there? What was your agreement? So, by the way, let me clarify for everybody else, just to hit. So I've got Andy here in the office, and Andy's saying, I got a listing, and then Ronnie decided to hold it open so he can gain leads. And then we get lucky, and one of those buyers that walk through says, I want to buy it. Who gets it? Well, typically, Ronnie, who's holding it open, is the one who's going to get it, not the listing agent. That buyer is with you, likes you, wants you to write it up, you're going to get it. But what I would say is make sure that whenever you're holding someone else's house open, that you know how all the leads and any contracts would come in. Now, it may be that the two of you hold it together because you know this is gonna have 50 people walking through the door.
Yeah.
Well, then you absolutely better decide how you're gonna handle any of the scenarios that could come up during that time period.
Verbally to agree with them?
Yeah, look, if I were working with you guys, would I be okay with verbal?
Yes.
Yeah,
we're from
absolutely.
the same office, actually.
Yeah, yeah, but
Actually,
sometimes it
I
doesn't
did
hurt to
an open
have,
house And I need somebody else to be with me. I
yeah,
couldn't find anybody.
yeah,
Actually, I don't know where to go. People go upstairs, go outside, go here.
Yep.
You need another person in.
You
open
need
house.
those two.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're gonna hold an open house, you know that puppy's gonna be busy, or it's a big house, cause I know Sally and Steven, they don't hold back. They've held $1 million houses open. But they do it together because obvious reasons with that one, so. Yeah. So gang, I think that's about it. I hope that this has brought more and more clarification as always. Never be afraid to give me a call or send me an email or a text. We'll answer everything that we can and, just keep out there. You know what you gotta do. Go talk to people, go see people. Ask them to sign contracts. And then send me the problems that you find. All right? So guys, have a great one. I hope you enjoyed the day. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, too.
You just have to go with your shot.
Okay, from that day, I learned no more trash.